Go ahead and get started. And we do have just some short intro slides, so maybe we'll have some additional folks trickling in before the formal start. But just wanted to welcome everybody to the virtual conference from NAAEE. I'm Ann Umali, and I'll be hosting the show today along with my colleagues here at NAAEE. And just wanted to say that we are so glad to see so many folks. We've got about 40 on right now, 40 folks that are joining the virtual conference today. And as you know, we are just trying to show a very tiny snapshot of some of the highlights that we would have had if we were all together in Puerto Rico. So thank you all for joining us. And thank you especially to our speaker today, Rena Payan. We're going to be hearing from her. And Rena is joining us today with the title of her talk, which is the Creating and Supporting Culturally Relevant Organizational Change. So that's quite a mouthful, and I'll be taking quite a bit of notes because this is so important. She's going to be talking about how Youth Outside helps support young people and other organizations doing this work as they try to promote a more inclusive work culture. And Rena's going to be talking a little about some of the tools and other resources that they've developed as they try to help other organizations promote this work. And so this is the agenda that we've got for you today. Before Rena digs into her talk, we're going to talk a little bit about how to use Zoom. And I'm going to say a little bit more about Rena, and then she's going to have her talk on about Youth Outside and the Cultural Relevancy Series that they've developed. We do have some time at the end for Q&A, and we'll also have some closing thoughts about what else we've got planned for the virtual conference this week. A quick note about how to interact with Zoom if you've never used it before. You'll see on the bottom right-hand side of your screen that there's a whole section on where you might want to enter some notes, jot your questions down. You can even introduce yourself and say your organization, which some of you have already done. If you do have questions throughout, we will be taking your questions there, and we hope to have some time at the very end of this webinar to address all of your questions. And as we go through, Rena will also be taking some pauses throughout to see if there's any clarifying questions. So feel free, don't be shy, jump in with your questions in that chat box. Additionally, if you do have any technical problems, we do have our masterminds on Zoom on standby, Kristen and Sai. So feel free to send a chat directly to them, or you can also send them an email if you're having any problems with audio or seeing the slides or anything like that. Okay, so just want to say a couple of things about our fabulous speaker, Rena Payan. Thank you, first of all, so much for joining us at sort of the last minute. And we did have originally a wonderful entire workshop planned, and she's condensed and distilled some of those really great ideas into a super short webinar. So you'll just be getting just a taste of what she'll be talking about. Rena works a ton on building equity and representation in outdoor education with Youth Outside, and she's been doing so much work, in particular working with youth and young adult leaders from all kinds of different backgrounds in California and the Bay Area. So we are so happy to have you here and sharing your expertise with us, Rena. So whenever you are ready, feel free to take control, and you can go ahead and get started when you're ready.
Great, thank you. It's so nice to be here. Once again, my name is Rena Payan. I'm the program manager for Youth Outside. I'll tell you a little bit more about what that means, but a little bit of my background really quickly is I taught outdoor education in Southern California for more years than I might like to mention. After working in Southern California and being the only Latina on teaching staff at that site for a very long time, I decided to move closer to my family and came up to the Bay Area of California and started working with young people in the outdoors here in the Bay Area. And I saw that my experience as a sole, sometimes person of color, but certainly a sole Latina in the environmental field was not an exception, but was rather a very common thing to experience. And so I started doing more work with organizations out here I started doing work with Bay Area Wilderness Training, in which I served on their board for a while. And I created a backpacking program for young people in San Francisco, George Washington High, to learn how to take middle schoolers backpacking. So I was teaching high schoolers how to take middle schoolers backpacking, and it was all done via public transit. So I've a little bit of experience in the outdoors, working with young people, and then that transitioned me into working with young adults now, which I'm very excited to do. So a little bit about youth outside. Here we go. There we go. Youth outside, our mission is that we strive to ensure that the lived experience of all youth is honored as part of their outdoor experience. What we do is we provide grant making, capacity building, and training to promote healthy lives and inspire future champions of the planet. So we have a variety of programs that that we try and impact young people's lives through. So we don't do direct service necessarily with young people, but we do capacity building trainings for organizations that work directly with young people to ensure that the young people's lived experience is part of their outdoor experience. And so a little bit about today, I'll be addressing questions as they're submitted. If we don't get to your question in the immediate time frame, there'll be a Q&A at the end. And a little bit more about Youth Outside. As I mentioned, we do grant making, so we provide grants to organizations working with young people in the outdoors here in Northern California and part of the Central Valley. Additionally, we run something called the Outdoor Educators Institute, which works with young adults 18 to 24 who would like to become outdoor or environmental educators, but may not have the sufficient resources that would make them a highly prized applicant. And we'll talk more about what that means a little bit down the road. We also run our Rising Leaders Fellowship, which is for entry-level to mid-level management individuals who are working within environmental organizations already and who would like to be an impetus for change, but also continue their career trajectory. We'll talk more in depth about the Cultural Relevancy Series and what that is in just a moment. And then additionally, we provide training and support, kind of like you're experiencing today, although certainly we normally try and have these conversations with a little bit more time, and certainly we enjoy having them face to face. So that's a little bit about what Youth Outside does. So today we're going to primarily focus on our Cultural Relevancy Series, which was run in 2016. It was a collaboration with the David and Lucille Packard Family Foundations, and it was a 7-month program designed to build their Green Portfolio grantees' capacity in cultural relevancy, equity, and inclusion. The case study we'll reference is on the Youth Outside website, youthoutside.org. Additionally, we'll have a few more tools and resources for you throughout the webinar. Please also note that as far as some of the tools that we are sharing with you all, some of them won't be shared after today's webinar because they require a little more intention and a little more time to facilitate. But we wanted to give you kind of a peek into some of the work that we do, as well as some of the thoughts that might be helpful for you to have as you're thinking about building your organization's capacity in regards to cultural relevancy, equity, and inclusion. So the case study we'll reference, we had 6 participants in this particular series. They all completed and worked specifically on goals within their organization to increase cultural relevancy, equity, and inclusion. A couple of things we know. We know that carving out the time to think critically and work on a plan about change can be really, really hard to carve out. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of intention, and it takes a lot of effort. And so having this 7-month program was intentional in bringing people together continually and consistently to provide this space. At Youth Outside, we really believe that equity, inclusion, and cultural relevancy need to stop being seen as a nice to have, but rather a matter of sustainability. A lot of times we talk to organizations where they have equity, inclusion, and cultural relevancy built into their mission statements or built into their values. And they're one of those instances that show up as a nice to have. Like, it would be nice if we talk about this more. It would be nice if we could create something around this, and they're not really integrated into the various levels of the organization. And at Youth Outside, we really believe that for an organization to remain relevant and to remain sustainable, we have to stop viewing these as nice to have, but rather a necessity. And so with that in mind, we created the Cultural Relevancy Series, which included all levels of an organization. And so we asked participants in the series to have representatives from the various levels of their organization. So we had board members participating, we had executive directors participating, we had line staff participating, and coordinators participating. And so we really tried to ensure that everybody was speaking the same language, that everybody was using the same kind of verbiage, and had a common understanding of some pretty heavy topics. Some of these topics, as you see on your screen, included what is cultural relevancy, thinking about how to change organizational culture, examining our unconscious bias, which we'll do a little more work around in a minute. We also covered board development, recruiting with intention, developing programs with a culturally relevant lens, exploring power and privilege, and we had a culmination in which organizations were asked to share about their final project and an outcome that existed because of the Cultural Relevancy Series. Once again, you'll see some screen captures of our case study, which can be found on our website. So a little bit about the outcomes that people experience. We found that when all participants were surveyed, all organizations were surveyed, that there was 100% better understanding of how power and privilege impacted dynamics in communication. So folks were understanding that power and privilege not only existed within their organization, which sometimes we can be in denial about because it means that even in our organizations, there may be unfairness or unjustness. And so people really understood that power and privilege existed and that it had a serious impact and implications for the way that they communicated as a team. 83% improved their understanding of unconscious bias, and 82% said they better understood microaggressions. We often kind of lump microaggressions and unconscious bias together because we find that unconscious bias is so insidious in so many ways, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that microaggressions are often a result of that. 80% could identify hallmarks of culturally responsive instructional approaches, and 90% said that they could now spot curriculum bias, which could negatively impact the youth who experience their programs. So we spent a great deal of time trying to make the unconscious conscious and dig out some of the roots of that bias so that we could become a more equitable and inclusive program. And then 75% walked away with resources and tools to develop a more culturally relevant board of directors, which maybe some of you are nodding your heads about how do you do that. Unfortunately, we won't get to that today, but you can read more about it in our case study. Great. I guess now I'd like to open it up if there are any immediate questions that folks have. While you all can look at this next screen. And if we can take one or two, I think they're being curated by our wonderful NAAEE staff. All right, no questions yet? Okay, we'll chug along if they come up.
Hey, Rena, I had a question. This is Anne.
Sure.
You mentioned that you had a number of folks that participated in the 7-month program. Can you just say really quickly what kinds of organizations were most interested in participating? If you could just do a quick mention of who you got to join and who participated and who got the most benefit out of that.
Sure. So we have a full list of the participants in the case study on our website, but all of the participants were youth serving organizations who are working in the outdoor and environmental sector here in the Bay Area of California. Because this particular session was collaborated with the Packard Family Foundation and the Morgan Family Foundation, they opened it up to their green portfolio. And so we had organizations such as Vida Verde, we had organizations including Curiosity and Ventana Wildlife Society. And so their missions varied, but the underlying similarity was that they served young people in outdoor and environmental education.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. So there was a question from Karen about if cultural relevancy is necessary for sustainability, what are we defining sustainability as? So when I mention that, how we view sustainability is when you think about your organizational long term, and you understand that there's a deep need for the work that you all do, and I am a strong believer that all young people should have access to environmental and outdoor education. Sustainability in this sense is regarding how relevant your organization can stay to the communities that are most in need of what you do. So it's wonderful to do the amazing work that you all do. And how are you engaging young people year to year in a way that grows with them, in a way that grows with the needs of their communities within that year, so that you can ensure that you have young people coming back to your organizations, that you have a history of family communication with your organizations, that families know that you all are a resource in your area. Are you having to build new bridges every year, or are you able to utilize the paths that you've already laid? Come back to you, whether they're educators or families, because they know that what you do is important to the lives that they live right now. And so that's a little bit more about how we define sustainability right now. So this was another great question. If the grantees were financially supported to participate in the cohort. So each of the participants in the Cultural Relevancy Series were invited to support through the Packard and Family Morgan Foundations. They opted in. They did not receive any additional funds for their staff to participate or any other financial support for them to participate each month, but they did receive a small stipend that worked on their project to help them achieve the goals of their project. And you can learn more about what those projects were and our learnings around that stipend in the case for support. We are tracking, there was a follow-up question, which is if the organization's successes or challenges are being tracked or supported in their efforts. We are tracking and following up with folks to see where their goals on their projects landed. Many of them were very successful. This is Curiosity's kind of success story and what happened with their organization and how they made a seemingly minor shift to ensure that their programs were more accessible long-term to families. And then there's another success story in the case study about one of the organizations who really was seeking to diversify their board and what that meant. And so we are tracking them and we are following up with them, and we're certainly hoping that when we provide the Cultural Relevancy Series in 2018, that some of them may even come back and participate for another round and kind of do some higher level thinking. Great. There's another question in exploring power and privilege. How were the experiences of folks in targeted groups centered as opposed to centering agent groups, i.e. centering whiteness instead of POC experiences? That's really, really interesting. And it's something that we do very intentionally. Our office and myself and my co-facilitator are women of color. And so when we think about power and privilege, and when we ask groups to kind of observe or practice their understanding of power and privilege, we look at the multitude of ways that folks can hold power and privilege. And so we invite folks through a very strategic facilitation as well as a worksheet to think about the ways that they hold power and privilege in regards to their race, in regards to their sexual identity, in regards to their gender identity, in regards to their age, in regards to their socioeconomic status, and their ability levels is another consideration we ask folks to consider. And so we recognize that power and privilege on any given day in the multitude of identities that an individual holds can be held in so many different ways. And so we ask folks to consider certainly that there are some that are more noticeable and more forward-facing in their day-to-day life, such as their race or their ethnicity even, or their ability level, their physical ability level certainly. And so we try and get folks to a point of action. So we're no longer just recognizing that power and privilege exists. We're accepting that we hold power and privilege in a multitude of ways. But additionally, we're asking folks how they can leverage the power and privilege that they hold in pursuit of equity and justice. And that is something that everybody can do within their identities and within the spaces that they hold. So it's a very deep day. It's a very heavy day in which we cover this. We do take a full day specifically around exploring power and privilege and how to leverage that. A lot of times we have folks who have never given thought or consideration to the ways that they hold power and privilege. And so we try and move rather rapidly from the shame or the guilt that folks may experience in their identities, having more power and privilege than others, into action and what it means to be actionable with that power and privilege in a way that's thoughtful and intentional and really amplifies the voices of folks that do not have power and privilege in the same way. Great, so those were a lot of really great questions. It's really exciting answering questions from the audience because you never know what you're going to get. But unfortunately, we do have to move on for the sake of the rest of our time together. And so if you haven't read this report that's out, many of you have probably heard of the Green 2.0 report that was released a few years ago, which is highly informative, I think, to the field as a whole in having these conversations. I know that it's highly informative to our work at Youth Outside, specifically around our capacity building and career accessibility trainings. And so we were really excited when they came out with this next report, this newest report that just was released, I think less than 6 months ago, Beyond Diversity, a roadmap to building an inclusive organization. And so if you haven't read the report, I highly, highly recommend it. At the very least, reading the executive summary. The screen that you have in front of you now is a screen capture of that executive summary with a sidebar that they wanted folks to think about, and they did all of their empirical data and they came out with these best practices when thinking about the recruitment and retention of talented staff, particularly talented people of color in the environmental sector. And so I highly recommend that. And it highly informs what we do as well. We were lucky enough to have Whitney Toom, the executive director of Green 2.0, come and do a discussion with our constituency and a Q&A around this newest paper, and some of the outcomes that came from that paper. Because we want to always amplify the voices of people doing brilliant work like Green 2.0 and Whitney Toom, we created this kind of complementary worksheet about intention setting and hiring and recruiting. And normally this would be, a 2-hour facilitation in and of itself, just thinking about this worksheet and what it means for the positions you may be looking to hire for. But I'm just going to hit some highlights to think about as you're thinking about hiring for your organizations. I'm going to hit 4 major areas, and then I'm going to take some questions. So if you want to start typing your questions now about this, feel free to. But I'll go through the first part, which is the first thing you always want to consider is the job title, which seems like a no-brainer, but what especially we have a tendency to do in the environmental field is to use some language or maybe even jargon or buzzwords that may not be the most appropriate for communities that may not have access to what you're saying, right? So if you're talking about a naturalist for an urban park, there may be people within that community that would be an ideal candidate and don't have an experience of what a naturalist is, right? The exposure level may not be there. And so the first thing you want to do is consider the job title that you're putting on a job posting. And if you're assuming that the folks reading it and the folks that would be the most candidate have an understanding of what that means. The second thing you want to think about is, excuse me, the skills that you're listing as necessary. And if the skills that you're prioritizing are skills that your organization can train on versus skills your organization cannot train on, we ask that folks consider what are the skills that are necessary to do the job that you cannot train for. That might include someone who speaks a foreign language. That might include experiences living in the neighborhoods that your youth are coming from. And so versus the skills that you can train on. Maybe it would be really nice and it's necessary for the job for someone to know how to put together a PowerPoint and run a PowerPoint. And is that something your staff can train a new hire on, right? Whereas your staff won't be able to train a new hire in Cantonese or Mandarin. And so we ask folks to be critical and really think about what their organization can provide to support a new hire if they're the right fit in the things that can't be trained in. The third thing I wanted to point out is skipping to the right-hand side, which would normally be the back of this worksheet. There's a series of blocks with words in it. And it says, does the job description include any of the following coded language? Coded language is a language that seems innocuous, but is sending a message to folks that do not see their identities reflected in that language, right? Some of this language is gendered. Things like, and this comes from multiple studies in job postings and the genderization of certain employment opportunities. So things like competitive and ambitious, we often find are more closely associated with maleness. And so it discourages women from applying. Things like independent and things like independent can be viewed both as gendered, but also exclusionary of abilities, right? If someone has a seeing eye dog or some other type of therapy animal, if someone uses a wheelchair, they may not automatically associate their identity with independence because their reliance on adaptive equipment. And so you want to think critically about who may be excluded because of the language choices that you have. Things like reliable transportation can also be exclusionary of socioeconomic backgrounds. Reliable transportation, especially here in the Bay Area, is definitely a source of privilege. And so we want to ensure that when we are thinking about the needs of this position, if the things that we're asking are really necessary. And the last thing I want to draw your attention to is the boxes directly before those that section, which is replacing the coded language. So once you've identified that this language exists within your job's description, if it does, you want to think about what was the intention behind including it. And then if you can suss out the intention, how you can replace that coded language, right? So we're not using the same language that disinvites people, but rather we're speaking to the intention behind it and inviting a more broad audience or a more inclusive audience. Great. So when you think about organizational change, you have to work from a lot of angles, and this tool is simply one that can help you think about who you're bringing into your team, and certainly doesn't speak to necessarily the support that they'll receive if they were to be hired, but maybe informing how well they already view themselves as an organizational fit. Great. So we have a couple of questions. Like, can you give examples of buzzwords to avoid in job titles and better replacements to consider? Yeah, so buzzwords could include, we see postings sometimes for culture keepers, and which sounds like a great title, but it doesn't necessarily speak to the intention behind it, which is you're asking for someone who is going to hold your organization accountable to a culture of inclusion, a culture of equity and justice, and you know, a culture keeper can sound really buzzy, and so if you don't know what that means, you may not feel like this is a job that you can do. It would be great if we could start queuing up the video. And then examples that might be a better fit for a broader audience would, and it may be a little more verbose, right? If you're seeking to hire a naturalist, you might change that from a naturalist to an outdoor educator. You might change that to, you know, youth leader in an outdoor nature setting. You might change it to nature educator, depending on your audience and what their experience might be with some of those spaces. Great. Thanks so much for your questions. Right now, we're going to move on to another section, and it's going to be about unconscious bias. And before we start this video, I will say this is not a video we created, so feel free to seek this one out on YouTube. It's just the beginning of a series that another organization does. And one of the things to consider is that one of the most insidious ways that exclusion operates is by being invisible until it negatively impacts you or an individual, right? So one of the insidious ways that exclusion operates is by being invisible. This invisibility is what unconscious bias is. And so I want to take some more time to talk a little bit more about unconscious bias. We are rapidly getting through our time, and so if you'll join me in watching this video, and then we'll talk a little bit more about unconscious bias and how that shows up.
Have you ever wondered how you make decisions? Most of us would like to think that we weigh alternatives and arrive at well thought out conclusions. But every day we make countless decisions without even realizing it. Every moment we're inundated with around 11 million bits of information. And yet research suggests that our conscious brains can only handle something like 40 bits of information a second. This means our minds are constantly processing information, and for the most part without our conscious awareness. Our brains evolved this way to ensure survival. This automatic thinking acts as a danger detector, determining if something or someone is safe. Where people are concerned, these decisions are hardwired into us. We respond positively to people we perceive to be like us and react against people perceived to be too different. Which was okay in life or death situations, but not so great in the workplace. Sometimes these mental shortcuts can lead us astray, especially when they cause us to misjudge people. When you see anyone, whether we think about it or not, we are automatically making judgments about them. The subtle assumptions we make about people can have lasting effects on who we're promoting, who we're hiring, and who we're putting into leadership positions. It's important to recognize that everyone has these biases. Think of it as a human brain software glitch. Of course, it seems unfair to choose a CEO because of height, hire someone because of their sex, or give lower performance scores to people who are overweight, and yet all of these things continuously happen without us even realizing we're doing it. The good news is, despite the complex nature of the problem, mitigating the impact of unconscious bias is a relatively simple matter of raising awareness and developing a more mindful approach at key decision-making times. Just as you'd avoid a dangerous blind spot when driving, we want you to become aware of your own unconscious blind spots. In doing so, you'll recognize the effects they can have on others, and you can take steps to combat unconscious bias in your workplace. Have you ever wondered?
Great, thank you. Something happened to our slide. If that's okay. Now we're all caught up. So a little bit more about unconscious bias. It's important to note that unconscious bias operates even when we openly admonish prejudice, and it's within all of us, right? So Youth Outside defines unconscious bias as biases and negative associations that people unknowingly hold. Unconscious biases are expressed automatically without conscious awareness, right? We've updated this to include that they may also be positive associations, which is something that occurs with like my model minority myth. But for our intended purposes, what we really want you to take away is that everybody has this unconscious bias. Just like the video demonstrated, it's a throwback to our ancestry and our lineage and where we come from, that we used to hold these in order to keep ourselves safe. Now we hold these in a world that no longer necessitates that. And so in order for us to think critically about how to move forward, knowing that we no longer need this type of safety net, we have to start making the unconscious conscious. Okay? Like I said, unconscious bias is within all of us, and it exists even if you say you're actively against prejudice, right? And so it's important to note that we can believe ourselves to be good people, which I'm sure all of us are, because you're on this webinar trying to learn more for the sake of the young people you serve. So we can believe ourselves to be good people, and we can genuinely be good people and still have our own unconscious biases, because it's informed in how we have grown up through this world, how we've grown up in this society, and so they're still there. If you want to learn more about unconscious bias, there are a litany of resources. One that I find particularly compelling is the podcast Invisibilia last season did an episode called The Culture Inside, which is a really great kind of easily accessible breakdown of unconscious bias and its impacts and implications. So check that out if you get an opportunity. Right now, I want us to think a little bit more critically about unconscious bias. So if you have an opportunity to grab a piece of scratch paper and a pen and get ready to write some things down, I'd love for you to close your eyes and picture this image. There is a rocky beach with seaweed bulbs laying among the sand and rocks, with a fog that hovers around a lone hiker who is standing in the center of the picture smiling. Now, if you'll take a moment and you'll think to yourself, what does the person you imagine look like? What age demographic are you assuming? What are they wearing? Are they a particular race? Are they a particular size or weight? And just jot down the ideas that you have. Okay. So once you've jotted down a couple of ideas, I'd like you now to close your eyes and picture this image. This is a sunny beach scene. Waves are crashing in the background. In the center of the photo is a yoga instructor in a headstand. The sky is bright blue and the beach is white sand. And just take a moment, picture it in your mind's eye. Jot down, if you have an opportunity, some of the same responses that you may have had from the first one, which could include what are the age demographics you assume, what are they wearing, are they a particular race, are they a particular size or weight. after you've written down a couple of ideas, or maybe you've just pictured it in your mind's eye, I'll invite you to meet our lone hiker. Just take note for a moment if this is what you imagined. If this was your instinct. And there's no shame or guilt, because we've been conditioned to picture outdoorsy people in a very particular light. This person doesn't necessarily meet the criteria that we often associate with what it means to be a hiker or to be an outdoorsy person. Okay. The next person that I was describing is this young lady. She is a self-identified fat queer yogi. Oh. And I think I need some technical support from our NAAEE staff. They no longer have my chat box viewable. Okay, so we'll continue on. So one of the, like I mentioned, one of the insidious ways that unconscious bias exists is that it allows us to believe a certain way, which consequently impacts our actions, right? Whether we intend it to or not, it does. So if we think about how we envisioned, at least initially, the participants in the last exercise, and we challenge ourselves to think about how our beliefs influence our actions, we start to understand how important it is to make the unconscious conscious. So this is another activity we created and we facilitated during the Cultural Relevancy Series, in which we explore how our beliefs, the beliefs that we hold, impact our actions. And so I'll give my example, and I'll walk us through this. Very briefly. So what is one belief you have about who recreates in the outdoors? And based on our experience with those last few images that may not have come to mind automatically, one belief that I regularly hold is that the outdoors are meant for thin and athletic and fit people, right? And then we'll ask you to name at least one example that caused you to develop that belief. And one example that certainly informs my belief that the outdoors are for thin and athletic and fit people is that when I go into an outdoor recreation store, very few brands carry my size. Very few brands carry above a large or an extra large. And so it further solidifies that belief that I have, that the outdoors is meant for thin people and consequently not people like me. So what is an assumption that you make because of your belief? So one might make the assumption, whether you verbalize it or not, based on the belief that you hold, the way that it is confirmed in the clothing sizes of outdoor retailers, that fat people don't recreate in the outdoors, right? And then your assumption can lead you to these actions, right? And some of the actions that may be created because of this belief system and the way that it's reinforced is that people are surprised by fat people in the outdoors, right? We see it. There's a great video clip, a commercial that REI recently put out that showcases Myrna Valerio, who is a fat marathoner, self-identified fat marathoner, and the astonishment that people have seeing her in the outdoors and seeing her participate actively in marathoning. And so this is just one example of ways and the insidiousness of those unconscious bias, the ways that our beliefs show up, even especially when we do not make them at the forefront of our mind. So what does this all mean? We're very quickly approaching the end of our webinar today. And so some key takeaways I hope that you receive during the course of this webinar before we open up the question and answers is that organizational change happens when we can be honest about our blind spots. Those blind spots inherently include unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is a system of beliefs we hold that will therefore influence our actions or inactions in some cases. And if your organizational change includes equity and inclusion, we have to start doing the hard work of taking the time to be intentional and making the unconscious conscious. So, thank you for participating in that webinar. I think we are now going to open it up to questions and answers. So, here we go again. Great. So there was a question about where can you find the Culture Inside podcast? It was a single episode of the larger podcast Invisibilia, which is a podcast through NPR. I think you can find it. I download it via Apple iTunes, but I think you can find it in other areas as well. Okay. Oh, and we have someone that just shared the link. That's great. Are there any additional questions about anything we covered today? If there is not,
I had one question.
Oh,
Rena,
sure.
this time. Going back to that worksheet on hiring processes, and you had a whole example of examples of coded language. Can
Yes.
you walk through maybe one of those and talk us through what the intention is behind it, and maybe just an example of how one might replace one of those phrases? Just an example.
Yeah, sure. So one of the pieces, and I'm looking at my cheat sheet here. One of the ones I pointed out specifically was independent and the use of independent. So sometimes we use it as looking for an independent personality, looking for someone who can work independently. And I think that a lot of times the intention behind that is someone who can recognize where they need to set their priorities within a project and work towards completing those priorities in a timely manner, which can be really challenging for folks, right? And so we want to speak to that intention, right? So rather than saying someone who can work independently, we might say looking for someone who wants to take on exciting new tasks, who knows when to ask questions, but might otherwise feel comfortable working or being autonomous or working in small groups or with little direction. And so sometimes what we have to get used to, and I think the big takeaway for that one is what we have to get used to is using more words, right? A lot of times we abbreviate the language and we cut out the intention because we assume everybody knows what we're talking about. And so sometimes it's going to require us to just use more words to fully communicate the intention behind what we're actually asking for. So the next question I see is if there's any particular guidance relating to raising awareness about unconscious bias with our board, as opposed to staff or coworkers. Any tactics that might be suited for something like that. So boards are always really challenging, as many of you know. because they're volunteer positions, and these are people who are truly well-intentioned and are looking to serve communities. And I think that if you can approach them with that understanding, and recognize that for them to do the best service to the communities they're working with, especially if they do not belong to those communities directly, they need to do a little more exploration about where they fit within that community. Because by serving on your board, they are inserting themselves into that community, whether they intend to or not. And that means that there needs to be more work on their part to better understand and relate to the communities you're working with. I know it's not a great deal of guidance, short of doing a workshop around it, which we do. We've run through the privilege chart with board members and administrative staff, and it's a process, right? None of this comes easy to any of us, myself included. And so we really have to be okay with carving out the time to prioritize these conversations and to help create greater understanding within our organizations, including at the board level. Sorry, I'm reading at the same time. So we do have additional resources. One of the slides that showed up earlier that you can find in our Case for Support online is an organizational survey about how well you are doing the work of cultural relevancy, equity, and inclusion. And so that's an open resource that you can utilize in your with your staff to get a better understanding, where your staff understands the work that you all are doing in regards to cultural relevancy, equity, and inclusion. It's a great starting place for everybody at different organizational levels within your organization, because you get a better sense for where more work can be done. And so there's that tool. And then in terms of mitigating bias within your curriculum or your programming, we have a couple more worksheets. Sadly, a lot of the resources that we create are very hard to facilitate outside of a training or a workshop. You can bring us to your organization, and you can follow up and find our website and learn more about that. But a lot of the resources that we have, because these conversations can be so challenging for folks, really should be facilitated in person and within your organization in a small group, so that honest conversations can be had, so that we can create a sense of safety and a sense of common understanding. But I would definitely, if you're looking for more resources to start thinking about these things, I would definitely look at that page in our Case for Support, specifically that has the organizational survey. I'm trying to decide. Oh, we don't have very much more time to answer more questions, and so I'm going to hand it back off to the NAAEE staff so that we can do our closing. And I believe they will share my email address. If you have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. If not, you can find the email address as well as some additional resources at youthoutside.org. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rena. This stuff is really hard, as you know, and we've made so much progress in the field, but as we all know, we have so much more work to do, and having organizations like Youth Outside helping us think about how we can be more culturally relevant is so, so important. And just judging from all the questions and discussion today, it does seem like there is definitely more need for us to support each other around this work. What resources are we finding that are really useful? What are some of the experience that we can share with our colleagues? So we do invite you guys to please do continue the discussion on EE Pro. We do have a group focused entirely on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the field. And we've got some great moderators there leading some great discussions. And so if people do have additional resources Rena, if you're not on this EE Pro group, please do join so that we can continue to hound you with your expertise. And others on the call, please do join in on this discussion, because we know this is going to be this is ongoing important work for all of us. And just to remind you, we will be continuing on with additional virtual conference sessions this afternoon. Please do join us. We've got a fantastic panel of experts this afternoon at 4 o'clock Eastern, folks from the education, policy, and conservation world that are going to be talking about climate change, education, and hope. We'll be there this afternoon, and we've got some more great sessions tomorrow. If you did not get your questions answered today, and as more thoughts and ideas percolate throughout the rest of your week, we'll be on EE Pro, and you'll find us there. Again, thank you guys again so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, and we'll be seeing you on EE Pro and online at further webinars this week. So take care, and thanks again, Rena.